Last time we were discussing Aristotle's conceptions of nature and soul, and we learned that Aristotle saw nature as consisting of natural kinds. There were the basic elements, earth, air, fire, and water, but also living things like plants and animals. And each of these living things have what Aristotle calls a nature. And it's because of their nature that each kind of thing behaves in the typical ways that it does. So, rocks are naturally inclined to move downward because the earth that composes them is naturally inclined to move downward. Fire is naturally inclined to move upward, and so on. Living things also have natures, but these are of course more complicated because plants and animals behave in ways that are more complicated than the ways that rocks do. And the natures of living things Aristotle calls their soul. To have a soul is to potentially be a certain kind of living thing. So a young child has a soul because it is potentially able to live a human life, which for Aristotle means being able to exercise reason. A dead body, by contrast, no longer possesses a soul because it cannot possibly come to live a human life. It will never be resuscitated like Frankenstein, say. In this video, what I'd like us to focus on is Chapter 2 of Book 1 in Aristotle's Politics, where he tries to show us that the form of a human, the soul of a human, is such that we're fundamentally political animals, and this distinguishes us, really, from all other kinds of natural things. And so what I want to do is go through this passage, which is crucial for understanding humans and the kind of natures that we have. So let's take it from the top. Aristotle writes, "A complete community constituted out of several villages, once it reaches the limit of total self-sufficiency, practically speaking, is a city-state. It comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well." Okay, so what's Aristotle talking about here? He has just been discussing men, women, families, and villages, and he argued that none of these is entirely self-sufficient. Men and women, individuals, are never entirely self-sufficient. They need families to be produced and be raised. And families are also not entirely self-sufficient because they cannot be produced without several families. Husbands and wives, of course, must naturally come from different families. But even villages of families are not entirely self-sufficient. One village, for example, might not be able to produce all the necessary goods that it needs for its village members to live well, to even be alive. Now, this self-sufficient alliance of several villages is what Aristotle calls a city-state, or polis. And the city-state, he thinks, exists by nature. And by this, Aristotle means that humans are the kinds of creatures that naturally live in these city-states. So in the next paragraph here, Aristotle argues that since humans naturally exist in city-states, and city-states exist by nature, humans are essentially political animals. That is to say, humans are the kinds of creatures to live in a polis. Polis is the Greek word for city, and the word political originally meant to be belonging to or related to a polis. And we as humans are so inclined to live in city-states that any one of us who does not live in one is either a poor specimen, as Aristotle says, or a god. So it's clear here that all humans have a form or soul that inclines us to live in political communities. And no other animal is political quite in the way that we are. So in the third paragraph, here Aristotle says, "It is also clear why a human being is more of a political animal than a bee, or any other gregarious animal. Nature makes nothing pointlessly, as we say, and no animal has speech except a human being." The key here for us to understand the passage is to see this distinction between speech and voice. A voice signifies what is pleasant or painful. So a bee or horse, for example, can make sounds so that it can express pleasure or pain to other bees in the hive or other horses in the herd. But that's not quite what a human has. We humans don't just have voice, we have speech. And speech is for making clear what is beneficial or harmful, and hence also what is just or unjust. For it is particular to human beings, in comparison to other animals, they alone have perception of what is good or bad, just or unjust, and the rest. And it is community in these that makes a household and a city-state. So the key idea is that a beehive or a herd of horses could be a kind of community, but it could never be a proper city-state because horses and bees can't think about and express in speech the good and the bad, the just and the unjust. It's worth noting here that the word for speech is the same Greek word we saw translated in on the soul as reason. So to be a human is to be capable of reason, and to be capable of reason is to be able to express in speech the good and the bad, the just and the unjust. And it's therefore to be able to participate in politics, where the good and the bad, the just and the unjust are precisely what's at stake. Okay, let's move on to the last paragraph of this passage. Here Aristotle claims that the city-state is not only natural, but also prior in nature to the household and to each of us individually. The whole is prior to any part in the way that you couldn't have a slice of bread without having a whole loaf prior to that. And you couldn't have a hand without having a whole body prior to it. So similarly, each of us could not possibly be flourishing human beings. We could not realize our nature as rational beings unless we lived in a city-state. The city-state is prior to each of us in this sense. Remember that all this follows from Aristotle's conception of nature as consisting of natural things having certain kinds of natures, and of living things as possessing certain kinds of souls, and we humans as having a certain kind of rational soul.